It's April 14th, 2021, and our reading in Judges today is in chapter 11. Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. "You are not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a group of adventurers gathered around him and followed him. Sometime later, when the Ammonites made war on Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head over all who live in Gilead." Jephthah answered, "Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head?" The elders of Gilead replied, "The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, "What do you have against us, that you have attacked our country?" The king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messengers, "When Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to Jordan. Now give it back peaceably." Jephthah sent back messengers to the Ammonite king, saying, "This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, but when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the desert to the Red Sea and to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Give us permission to go through your country.' But the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed at Kadesh. Next, they traveled through the desert, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab, passed along the eastern side of the country of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. They did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was its border. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and said to him, 'Let us pass through your country to our own place.' Sihon, however, did not trust Israel to pass through his territory. He mustered all his men and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all his men into Israel's hands, and they defeated them. Israel took over all the land of the Amorites who lived in that country, capturing all of it, from the Arnon to the Jabbok and from the desert to the Jordan. Now, since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your god Chemosh gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Are you better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with them? For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroah, the surrounding settlements, and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? I have not wronged you, but you are doing me wrong by waging war against me. Let the Lord, the judge, decide the dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites." The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message Jephthah sent him. Then the spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns, from Aroah to the vicinity of Minnith, as far as Abel Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched, because I've made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and the girls went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite custom that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. Amen. And so the drama of Jephthah begins, a drama in 5 acts. Verses 1 to 3, we have the rejection of Jephthah. Yes, he's a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead, his mother was a prostitute. So the other sons of Gilead, they look down on him, they reject him. His face doesn't fit, his origins are squalid, and he is rejected, the rejection of Jephthah. But then, verses 4 to 11, the reception of Jephthah. He's welcomed back because they're desperate, because the Ammonites are attacking them, making war on Israel. And this man is a mighty warrior. They need him now. So he's received back. And look what it says in verse 11. And the people made him head and commander over them, from the depths to the heights, we might say. Then verses 12 to 28, there is the request of Jephthah to the warring factions, specifically to the king of the Ammonites. Jephthah's trying his hand at diplomacy here. It's always better to talk than to fight, but he is a fiery character. If you read it again, by the end of it, he's virtually declaring war on them. This is not the way, really, to go about diplomacy. So it's not surprising. Verse 28, the king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message Jephthah sent him. They are determined to attack them, and Jephthah and his army are determined to fight back. So the request of Jephthah is not effective. There's going to be a battle, and there is. This man, unlike Abimelech in the previous chapter, who seems to have had no relationship with the Lord, who really did everything to raise himself up into a position of authority and rule. Unlike him, this man, it says in verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. So now, verses 29 to 33, we have the rout of Jephthah, R-O-U-T. Anointed by the Spirit of the Lord, he, leading his troops, they rout their enemies. They totally destroy them. End of verse 33. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. But then within this passage, within the great victory, there is, of course, the great tragedy, the thing, sadly, that we mostly remember about Jephthah. And we might call this the recklessness of Jephthah. That's verses 30 and 31, to do with the vow that he makes in verse 30. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes, and so on. It's obvious, it's there in front of us. We know all about this. And what's going on here? This is a kind of bargaining with God. We've seen this again and again, particularly in the book of Judges, when God's people, when their faith is low, this is how they treat their relationship with God. It's a kind of deal. It's a bargaining thing. If you do this for me, I'll do this for you. That is not a good way to relate to God, to deal with the Almighty, Sovereign, Holy One. This indeed is reckless behavior, as we shall see. This is very, very foolish, as we shall see. This is totally unnecessary. If he just believed in the Lord, trusted in him, prayed, committed his way to the Lord, he doesn't have to be making all these fancy, weird and wonderful vows. He doesn't have to be doing any of that. And of course, the result, the end of it all, is personally devastating for him and his family, because whatever comes out of that door, he does have a mighty victory. He does go home in triumph. And the first thing, maybe he thought it was going to be an animal. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. But he'd been so foolish in making the terms of this vow so open and so ambiguous, and the most terrible, devastating thing does. Verse 35, it's his daughter who comes through that door. And under this fifth point, I said there were 5 acts or 5 points to be made here. We might add recklessness stroke wretchedness. Look what he says in verse 35. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched, because I've made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." It is heartbreaking, and he ends up miserable and wretched. We might add a final, almost like a PS or like the epilogue of the story, and that might be verses 38 to 40, the remembrance of Jephthah. This annual custom every year, young women from Israel going out for 4 days at a time to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. And in the history of Israel, this was one of the things that they remembered, perhaps the only thing, the main thing they remembered about Jephthah. I don't think Jephthah's mentioned in the New Testament, because he's a very patchy, very mixed, and ultimately a very tragic character and a very foolish man. But vows and oaths are mentioned, and the Lord Jesus says this in Matthew 5, verses 33 to 37. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. That's why Jephthah does what he does. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.